ocean crisis that's occurring. Senator Flake.
Thank you, and thanks for calling this hearing. I appreciate the testimony. And Ambassador Haas, you articulated my greatest fear. I often express, if people ask what my concern is about the future, it's that we will wake up some morning and the financial markets will have already decided that they're not going to buy our debt, or we'll have to do it at a premium, and then interest rates go up, and then we're in a vicious circle, and we are Japan for decades or generations, just lost economic growth, and it's just impossible given the austerity measures we'd have to implement and what we'd have to do to have the economic growth that we need. But let me just turn to one aspect of the inability to have the resources with regard to soft power. We generically call it foreign aid. It's one of the least popular things to defend here. But if you can talk a little about that, or not just funding our national security commitments abroad, but ensuring that we are in a position to defend those interests abroad, say in Africa. Much of our ability to go in and help countries combat Boko Haram or Al-Shabaab is because of our willingness in prior years to have helped them with the PEPFAR, with the AIDS crisis through PEPFAR, or to help with other initiatives. Can you talk a little about that and how important that is, our engagements around the world, not just in national security, but prior to that?
Thank you, sir. First thing to say about foreign assistance is you would think we were spending a lot more on it than we are. So the controversy or the reputation it has is at variance with the facts, as you know, and as everyone sitting up there knows. We spend quite modest amounts on it. I also think it's useful to differentiate among various types. Humanitarian aid, I think it's one of the things that, again, as an American citizen, I feel best about. It's interesting, you mentioned PEPFARs. What an extraordinary initiative that was. It's good old-fashioned humanitarian aid. It's kept a lot of people alive who would otherwise not be alive. And that's just the sort of thing we should be doing both as a government. We also do more of it as a society than any other country in the world. That's something Americans can be proud of. I differentiate that from developmental kind of aid. And that gets a little bit more complicated, but I think the Millennium Challenge effort was a really important and useful intellectual and political innovation because it became much more conditional in linking assistance for countries that were, as you know, adopting certain types of governance reforms, which again I thought was a good time, all of which is different than security aid, whether it's in the economic form, ESF, or military aid. But we need to do all of it. I actually thought when I was in government, one of the most valuable and cheapest forms of security aid were things like IMET, the training and the educational assistance. And for very small amounts of money, in absolute and relative terms, we could bring leading, say, people at mid-career levels over to United States staff schools. They would get exposed to American theories of civil-military relations, to professionalism. They would go back, in many cases, through the military ranks or through political ranks. They would have disproportionate influence in their, or significant influence within their own societies. It was a tremendous investment in promoting rule of law and respect for civil-military relations. So I actually think, all things being equal, that foreign assistance writ large turns out to be a pretty good return on investment for the United States. And it comes back to what we're talking about here. It's one of the things you don't want to see crowded out. It's too easy for a lot of things to get crowded out because by the time you're paying interest on the debt and you're dealing with entitlements, national security and discretionary domestic spending, they're the collateral damage, if you will, of where we're heading on debt. And we've got to figure out ways to protect them. The only way I know how to protect them is some combination of dealing with the drivers of debt and dealing with and adopting policies that accelerate economic growth.
Well, I appreciate that. It's often humorous to hear this discussion about building a wall, the Mexican border, and having the Mexicans pay for it. Some were saying, well, let's just cut off foreign aid if they won't. It was talked about foreign aid to Mexico. There really is none other than some cooperation on drug initiatives and things like that. So it's often misunderstood, and it's often assumed that it's a lot larger than it really is. But I appreciate the comments in this hearing. I do have a huge concern. This is bigger than any concern out there in terms of terrorism or nuclear proliferation, because if we don't deal with this, we won't be able to respond to any of those threats. So it's the root of all of it. And I do worry that we're really on borrowed time here. The point at which other countries will have hit that point where the financial markets decide. We've passed that. We're just the best house in a bad neighborhood. And I don't know how much longer we can go. But what I do know is that once we wake up that morning when the markets have already decided, it's too late then without a good deal of pain and suffering for a number of years. And so I hope we reach the realization before to deal with this. And everyone knows what it's going to look like, at least the broad parameters. We've got to bring in more revenue, not necessarily by raising rates, but by closing loopholes on the tax code. We've got to do some kind of change CPI on Social Security or limit the growth thereof. Medicare, it's going to be some bigger forms of means testing. I mean, any real solution is going to have those broad contours at least. I just wish we'd get to it sooner rather than later. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, if I could, just again, since I didn't use my time on the front, most entities in the world try to protect themselves from the market fluctuations that occur. And what I hear so many people in this hearing saying, well, the market's been good to us, so what do we have to worry about? Well, the fact is that a great nation or a great company or a great entity is constantly thinking about those things that could occur and trying to ensure that they've done everything they can to protect themselves from it. Whereas what we're doing is just rolling along and saying, hey, these guys have been good to us, and you know, we're faster than the slowest other country in the world, so we're going to be okay. And I never expected that to come out of this hearing today. Senator Rubio.
Thank you. Well, first, I'm glad you're holding this hearing. It's a very interesting issue that I think brings into focus the broader narrative that Mr. Haas spoke about. You know, one of the things that's happening in this country that's led to some of this turmoil